Hi, my name is Rebecca Hartkoff-Schloss, and I'm an associate professor of Atlantic World History at Texas A&M University. What that means, Atlantic World History, is that when I'm asking questions of the historical past, 18th or 19th centuries, rather than thinking about things confined just to one nation state, like France or Great Britain, I consider how connections around the Atlantic world basin and the movement of peoples and things and ideas influence and shape those historical events. I'm going to use an Atlantic world history approach today in my discussion of colonial society in a revolutionary era. So, on to the slides. In mid-October of 1790, Vincent Auger, jeune, or the younger, a free French man of one-quarter African descent, landed in Saint-Domingue, France's most prosperous sugar-growing island in the Caribbean. 2 years earlier, he had departed the island for metropolitan France, stopping first in Bordeaux, where he and his two sisters had spent 5 years going to school, and then proceeding to Paris to conduct family business. While in the capital, he experienced the early days of the French Revolution, meeting with other so-called gens de couleur, or free men of color, to celebrate the storming of the Bastille and the passage of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in August of 1789. He even dined with the Marquis de Lafayette and other members of the Friends of Blacks Society before boarding a ship in May of 1790, bound first for London, then to Charleston, South Carolina, and finally reaching home in Saint-Domingue's northern province in early October. After landing, Auger proceeded almost immediately to the home of his colleague, Jean-Baptiste Chaban, another free French man with one-quarter African ancestry, who owned property near Auger's family sugar plantation in what was known as the Don Don Parish. Within days, nearly 300 other gens de couleur arrived to discuss how the revolution's new ideas about citizenship might change their lives as artisans, farmers, ranchers, or even property owners. Many also wondered how their status as veterans who had bravely fought for the French at the Battle of Savannah during the American Revolution might influence their political rights. Less than 4 months later, in February of 1791, they received their answer. After a month-long trial, the island's French European governor and local white colonists charged Auger and Chaban with treason, executed them and 21 other gens de couleur, and sentenced 13 more to life, or actually death, in the galleys. This so-called Auger's affair, or the Mulatto Revolution, lasted less than 4 months and took place nearly 6 months before the revolution of enslaved individuals that overturned Saint-Domingue colonial society and ultimately established Haiti as the first Black republic in the Atlantic. Looking more closely at this event allows us to consider some important questions about what scholars call the age of revolutions, and especially the interconnections of people, ideas, and things around the Atlantic basin. While you're listening to this lecture, here are some guiding questions to help you focus. First, how did race influence ideas of citizenship in the early years of the French Revolution? Second, what was the relationship between military service and citizenship in the early years of the French Revolution? And third, how important were transatlantic connections for free mixed-race individuals in the late 18th century? As the Auger affair demonstrates, during the French Revolution, many gens de couleur believed that their local militia experience or service in the French army during previous international conflicts should earn them full citizenship and equality with their European brethren. This was certainly the case for men such as Chaban and perhaps even Auger, who had participated in the Battle of Savannah during the American Revolution. Chaban and Auger were members of a group known as the gens de couleur, free men of color, or the affranchis, freedmen, in 18th century Saint-Domingue. In relation to the broader demographics on the island, the white population, regardless of social class, numbered around 30,800 individuals at the beginning of the revolution in 1789. Enslaved people of African descent comprised about 480,000 individuals, and the gens de couleur around 24,800 people. The gens de couleur, almost as sizable in number as the white population, were a legally free but socially intermediate group. By 1763, they had dominated the artisanal trades in Saint-Domingue, meaning they were butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and they also owned a number of the coffee plantations on the island. This was especially true in what was known as the Western Province. If you look at the map in the lower right-hand corner, you can see Saint-Domingue divided into 3 different provinces. The Northern Province, with the capital at Cap Français, and where the majority of our story will take place, the Western Province, and the Southern Province. It was in that Western Province that gens de couleur owned the majority of property. By 1789, however, gens de couleur also owned property in the Northern Province. In the southern part of the Northern Province, however, in land that was less likely to grow sugar. The parishes of Dandon and Grande Rivière Parish, were especially important for gens de couleur who grew coffee and indigo in those areas. And others owned property from serving as what were known as sugar brokers. These were intermediates between plantation owners and merchants in continental France who would purchase the unprocessed sugar and refine it in France's Atlantic port cities. In 1778, just 2 years into the American Revolution, France and North American colonists formed what was known as the Franco-American Alliance. In addition to providing resources, France also agreed to provide soldiers. In 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in North America, France had looked to shore up the defenses of its Caribbean islands, like Saint-Domingue, by creating a civilian militia, which was comprised of white officers and free men of mixed race descent. Between 1765 and 1778, many gens de couleur, and even enslaved men, viewed militia service as a form of social mobility, and as a result, by the time of the Franco-American Alliance, Saint-Domingue boasted a large contingent of free men of color with military experience. In March of 1779, France's king, Louis XV, dispatched the Comte d'Estaing to Cap Français in the Northern Province. His job was to recruit volunteers for an as yet unnamed expedition that would serve the Franco-American Alliance. The Comte and his fleet had just recaptured Grenada from the British, and the French crown hoped to draw on this victory, as well as the Comte's previous successful service on the island, to supply men promised in the Franco-American Alliance. In addition to taking on French European recruits, d'Estaing also looked to reform what was known as the chasseurs volontaires, a voluntary light infantry comprised solely of gens de couleur who had distinguished themselves during the 7 Years' War. In his efforts, d'Estaing called on Captain Vincent Olivier, himself an aged free black veteran, as well as other former free-colored military officers from earlier campaigns. They focused their recruitment on the Dandon and Grande Riviere parishes in the northern province, and by late April, nearly 900 men, disproportionately from the region where Auger and Chavannes lived, had joined the new chasseurs. Scholars disagree as to whether or not Vincent Auger, who would have only been 22 at the time, actually volunteered for the free-colored regiments that ultimately would fight the British at the Battle of Savannah. Evidence clearly indicates, however, that his partner, later, in demanding voting rights for gens de couleur in 1790, Jean-Baptiste Chavannes, had served as a sergeant in the campaign, as did at least 28 other gens de couleur who went on to play important leadership roles in what we now call the Haitian Revolution. In response to American entreaties and those of the French consul at Charleston, South Carolina, and because he had heard that Savannah was lightly defended, in August of 1779, Comte d'Estaing decided to move against Savannah. In that month, he, along with 545 chasseurs volontaires and 900 French European soldiers from other French West Indian islands, departed Saint-Domingue with the goal of retaking Savannah from the British. D'Estaing believed that the battle would be a relatively minor engagement, and that the captured town, which had originally fallen to the British in December of 1778, could be left to the Americans to occupy. The map on your screen was made by a French engineer. It shows the city of Savannah encircled by a combined French and American set of forces. By early September, the French fleet had dropped anchor off of the Georgia coast and joined those American rebel forces in laying siege to the fort at Savannah. D'Estaing, for his part, had ordered that, and here I'm quoting, the people of color be treated at all times like the whites. They aspire to the same honor. They will exhibit the same bravery, end quote. Ultimately, that was not to be, however. Due to their recent recruitment, both D'Estaing and his American official counterpart put the chasseurs volontaires to work digging trenches around the strongly fortified city of Savannah. Only a dozen or so would actually participate in one of the failed assaults on British fortifications. After a month of blockade and siege, and despite the efforts of the chasseurs volontaires and other French European recruits, the combined American-French attack failed, leaving 521 of the French recruits dead or wounded. Only one chasseur was killed, and 7 were wounded, defending the French trenches against the bloody counterattack undertaken successfully by the British. As the October weather worsened, D'Estaing's fleet departed the Georgia coast, leaving approximately 100 chasseurs to provide cover for Revolutionary and French soldiers forced to evacuate to Charleston, South Carolina. 25 of them would die in the process. Although the Savannah campaign had concluded, Saint-Domingue's free-colored volunteers soon discovered that their military service had not. Within 3 months of the battle, the remaining 500 or so chasseurs were scattered over 3,000 miles, with 200 being dispatched to the island of Grenada in the Caribbean, 150 sent to continental France, and 150 more returned to Saint-Domingue. Most of those actually sent to Grenada would never return home, and many who did make it back to the island wouldn't return for more than 3 years. As for the 62 chasseurs volontaires who'd made it safely to Charleston, South Carolina, back in 1779, when the British took the port in March of 1780, they sold those free men of color from French Saint-Domingue into chattel slavery in the North American theater. The image in the bottom corner is actually a monument to the chasseurs volontaires erected in Charleston, South Carolina. Ultimately, the Savannah campaign was an important but unsuccessful experiment for both colonial administrators and free men of color. French officials had hoped the occasion would demonstrate the value of free colored military service. But American officers' reticence to deploy the chasseurs in battle and the failure of the siege of Savannah itself left doubts about the chasseurs' abilities. For their part, although free men of color like Chauvin had hoped that participation would enhance their social status on the return to the island, ultimately, that proved not to be the case. In 1780, royal officials in Cap Français attempted to turn the Volontaires into a regular military unit in which all men of color would be required to serve. And they also transferred the colonial militia's most difficult duties to gens de couleur units and reserved commissioned officer status for whites only. As a result, what was once a path to upward social mobility for free men of African descent closed down. Less than a decade after the failed Battle of Savannah, Vincent Auger the Younger found himself in a difficult economic situation. Although his family was among the wealthiest gens de couleur in the northern province's Dondon Parish, the return to strict mercantilist policies after the American Revolution and a series of bad harvests forced him to travel to continental France in late 1788. There, he would negotiate with family creditors in Bordeaux, where his sisters were being educated, and eventually find his way to Paris. During the first months of 1789, Auger would have witnessed the tumult surrounding King Louis XVI's calling of the Estates General, an advisory body made up of 1,200 property-owning French European men from around the kingdom. He also would have witnessed their efforts to draw up lists of grievances to be discussed by that body and the king. Through correspondence with other gens de couleur in Saint-Domingue, he too would have been well aware of the fact that even though he and other gens de couleur families in Saint-Domingue owned considerable property, because of their race, they were excluded from colonial committees between January and April of 1789 in Saint-Domingue, and therefore left out of the process of drawing up lists of grievances. Throughout the spring and summer of 1789, the Estates General transformed into a National Assembly, intent on drafting France's first ever constitution. Citizens stormed the dreaded Bastille, a royal prison known for housing innocent victims, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen declared liberty, equality, and brotherhood theoretically for all men. In the midst of these dramatic changes, Auger gathered with other free mixed race and French European inhabitants from France's West Indian colonies to discuss how the new revolutionary ideals would affect the island's racial and economic order. In early September, he met with members of what was known as the Maciat Club, a group of white Saint-Dominguean plantation owners. And he suggested at that meeting that they join ranks as wealthy property owners to demand important concessions for the colony in the new constitution. Despite their shared economic interests, however, club members rebuffed Auger's offer and focused instead on their racial differences. After his failures at the Maciat Club, and as the National Assembly discussed the future terms of citizenship in the French nation, Auger shifted from making common cause with white property owners to denouncing their discrimination against gens de couleur in Saint-Domingue based on the free mixed-race men's African ancestry. In mid-September, Auger, as well as other Saint-Domingue artists, domestic servants, and property owners of mixed-race descent, gathered to found what was known as the Colonial American, a society intended to denounce racial inequality among free men in the colonies. Now, it's important to note that while the Colonial American sought racial equality among whites and free men of mixed-race descent, they did not call for an end to chattel slavery. In fact, some members of the group personally owned enslaved individuals, and many depended on enslaved labor to make their living. In their quest to thwart race-based inequality among France's free men, throughout the fall of 1789, as the National Assembly debated the qualifications for French citizenship, Auger and other gens de couleur met with those who argued that liberty, equality, and brotherhood should be extended to all French men. This included Julien Ramon, a wealthy mixed-race plantation owner from Saint-Domingue, who had highlighted the military service of gens de couleur when he petitioned the National Assembly for their representation in the legislative body. Auger and Ramon also met with members of the Society of the Friends of Blacks, in French known as the Amis des Noirs, a group that had called for the gradual emancipation of enslaved individuals. When they dined with the Marquis de Lafayette, a member of the society, and the head of the National Guard, a newly created citizens' militia, both Auger and Julien Ramon wore Paris militia uniforms, highlighting recent claims that military service should afford political rights. In late October of 1789, when the National Assembly finally outlined distinctions between what they called active and passive citizenship, active citizen meaning those who could vote or hold office, passive citizens being those who had what we might now consider basic human rights, that National Assembly said nothing about race or military service. But they did decree only men over the age of 25 who paid direct taxes equal to 3 days of labor might serve as active citizens. In Saint-Domingue, gens de couleur like Jean-Baptiste Chavannes had watched the ongoing debates over citizenship with great interest. Long before they received official word of the National Assembly's distinction between active and passive status, they decried racial discrimination on the island. In fact, at the end of October, Jean-Baptiste Chavannes and 42 other free mixed-race farmers, ranchers, and artisans called for the right to political participation, not on their status as properties, but based on their military service for France, and in particular, on their participation in the 1779 Battle of Savannah. Between October and December, letters detailing citizenship debates in continental France, as well as news of ongoing racial discrimination in Saint-Domingue, crossed the Atlantic, fueling debates about how revolutionary changes in metropolitan France would apply in France's West Indian colonies. At the end of December of 1789, Auger and 28 mixed-race property-owning men tried to leave continental France and returned to Saint-Domingue to further the political rights of their gens de couleur colleagues. Evidence suggests that members of the Massiac Club, however, prevented their departure out of fear that Auger would push colonial authorities to actually grant eligible gens de couleur both voting and office-holding status. During January and February of 1790, tensions in Saint-Domingue's northern province escalated between white property owners and Chavannes and nearly now 200 gens de couleur who increasingly complained of the island's racial inequality. By mid-March, the situation had deteriorated so much that the governor, who characterized Chavannes and his followers as quote, armed for insurrection, end quote, finally agreed to meet with the men in order to avoid physical violence. As the situation went from bad to worse in Saint-Domingue, in late March of 1790, the National Assembly finally clarified that active citizenship would now include and basically require militia service, although they once again omitted any explicit reference to race. Colonial officials in Saint-Domingue, for their part, refused to implement the measure that provided eligible gens de couleur, like Auger and Chavannes, those political rights. Perhaps motivated anew by the National Assembly's clarification of active citizenship and colonial officials' repeated attempts to deny gens de couleur their constitutional rights, in May of 1790, Auger and his 28 mixed-race followers finally departed continental France, stopping first in London and then in Charleston, South Carolina, before finally landing 5 months later in Saint-Domingue. Shortly after his arrival in the northern province, Auger met with Chavannes and other gens de couleur at the home of Chavannes' mother's coffee plantation in Grande Rivière Parish. Over the next 10 days, Auger and Chavannes were joined by an increasing number of free mixed-race men, some of whom met the property requirements for active citizen, and others who did not, but who had served France and its military during the American Revolution. An overwhelming number of those gens de couleur had participated in the Battle of Savannah. On 2 occasions, Auger and Chavannes wrote Saint-Domingue's governor, demanding that he implement the March 1790 decree, which would grant the majority of those in attendance political rights. In response, on October 29th of 1790, the island's governor proclaimed that Auger, Chavannes, and the now nearly 300 armed gens de couleur who had gathered in the northern province in open rebellion. In response, on October 29th of 1790, the island's governor proclaimed that Auger, Chavannes, and the nearly 300 armed gens de couleur who had gathered in the northern province were in, quote, open rebellion, end quote. And as governor, he sent close to 500 French European soldiers to attack the so-called rebel stronghold. After withstanding the initial assault, most of the free men of color who had gathered in Grande Rivière Parish returned to their homes. By early November, Auger, Chavannes, and 24 free men of color, however, escaped across the border to Spanish Santo Domingo. Within a month, Spain had extradited the French gens de couleur back to Saint-Domingue and the governor's care, presumably in December of 1790, to avoid an international incident. A month later, in January of 1791, the governor convoked a special council and called on the whites-only Provincial Assembly of the Northern Province to conduct a full-scale investigation of what was now called the Auger affair. His actions, and most specifically his order to conduct the trial behind closed doors and to arrest hundreds of gens de couleur, including many veterans or sons of veterans of the Battle of Savannah, as co-conspirators, shocked supporters of racial equality around the Atlantic Basin. Not surprisingly, after a month, officials found Auger and Chavannes guilty of armed insurrection and treason. They condemned 21 other mixed-race men to death and sentenced 13 more to death in the galleys. In mid-February, on the military parade ground of Cap Français, which was crowded with 2 regiments of chasseurs volontaires and dozens of enslaved laborers, Auger and Chauvin, dressed in his sergeant's coat from the Battle of Savannah, were broken on the wheel and dismembered, and their heads were displayed on pikes as a warning to enslaved and free men of African descent of what happened to those who demanded racial justice. As the Auger Affair, or Mulatto Revolution, as it is sometimes called, demonstrates, race played an incredibly important role in ideas about citizenship in the early years of the French Revolution. Although the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in August of 1789 theoretically guaranteed liberty, equality, and brotherhood to all Frenchmen, in practice, it only applied to white property-owning men. Men of mixed-race descent, like Vincent Auger, were excluded from active citizenship based solely on their racial background. The affair also shows us the important role that military service played in the minds of men like Jean-Baptiste Chauvin and other gens de couleur who had fought at the Battle of Savannah. They believed that their local militia experience or that their service in the French army during previous international conflicts should earn them full citizenship and equality with their European brethren, regardless of whether or not they were property owners. The creation of the National Guard, a citizens' militia in metropolitan France, seemed to reinforce the importance of military service in patriotic citizenship during the early years of the French Revolution. So too did the proud displays that men like Auger, Julien Raymond, and Jean-Baptiste Chauvin exhibited by wearing their military uniforms. Finally, with the movement of people, ideas, and commodities around the Atlantic in the last half of the 18th century, we can see the importance of transatlantic connections for social mobility, for free mixed race individuals around the Atlantic basin.